So first question I got was how to make time for extracurriculars like volunteering, for example, and also prioritize doing well in your classes. So this is one of those, everyone does it their own way. There's no like I can't invent an hour in the day, right? There's nothing I can do to like, oh, there's magic in if you set your clocks just right, you actually gain a half hour in the day, right? There's no such thing. Everyone balances these things differently. I will take a moment to just say that I find that there's always two kinds of students out there. There are the students who they're focusing so heavily on extracurriculars that they're kind of negating their like studies, and they're forgetting that their main job is to have a good GPA and good MCAT, right? That is number one. And then there's the people who hear that MCAT and GPA are number one, and they totally forget the extracurriculars. And so I always say, it's really important to focus on both. And the ones who are already focusing too much on extracurriculars, like they don't hear the MCAT GPA part. They just go, oh, great. You just confirmed that they're both important. Therefore, I'm just going to double down and do all the extracurriculars. And the ones who, need to hear that the extracurriculars are important, all they hear is, oh, you said MCAT and GPA are number one. So I'm going to buckle down and just double down on that. And I will say I've seen it go south both ways. I've seen students who have fantastic scores and great GPA and have nothing to talk about on their application and struggle with the application cycle. And I've seen students who vice versa. And I would say probably the latter is more prominent, the latter is more common, where students focus so much on extracurriculars and they don't have such great grades. The ones who have really great grades usually have extracurriculars to talk about. Um, so I usually see more so the latter, people focusing too much on the extracurriculars, not focusing enough on the grades. They're both really important. So just the way it goes is MCAT GPA are really important to get the interview, right? That's really the like first metric that they're going to look at to whether or not to offer you an interview. That's the first thing that their system is going to come down to. When I vouch for students to get interviews at different schools, the first question I always get is, what is their MCAT and GPA? Right? Because that's really the number one prognostic factor of how someone's going to do in medical school or how someone's going to do on their boards. Are they a good test taker? And that's number one, right? The schools really want to make sure they're letting in strong students who are going to do well. So first step is MCAT GPA. Extracurriculars are really important because the next thing they do is when they give you the interview, they want to hear your story. They want to hear from you. They want to make sure you have good character. And those really shine when you do your extracurriculars. So they're both really important. They're just important at different stages. But MCAT GPA we usually rank that a little bit higher because that's really the factor as to whether or not you'll be a good student. Then the extracurriculars are just there to show character, but are both really important. As far as making time, again, it's quite difficult. I would imagine as an undergrad, when I did undergrad, I didn't have school every single day. Or if I did, I definitely had off on weekends. Or if I had classes at night, I definitely had time during the day. There's nothing wrong with doing an extracurricular only once or twice a week for a few hours. I mean, that's fine. You just have to accumulate a certain number of hours, and it should be over a period of time. I would say probably around at least 6 months. You don't anything below 6 months just shows that you kind of start and you don't really finish it. So 6 months is a pretty good benchmark, although not everything you do has to be 6 months. It's just a pretty good benchmark for a lot of things that you do. Like 6 months is a nice chunk of time to show that you were serious about it. And do it in your free time. Again, you can get quite a bit done if every 6 months you start or end another project, and you're doing it just once or twice a week, a few hours a week. You can rack up the hours and you can rack up the number of experiences you have. I will say that you're kind of taught. I mean, at least I was always taught like better not to have too many experiences. Focus on the ones you have, show a lot of commitment, do something for 2 years rather than do two or three things for short periods of time. And there's definitely truth to that. It's definitely good to have some of those long-standing projects that you're working on. It can show consistency and can show dedication, and those are really important things. But I'll also point out that there is a little bit of like box ticking you have to do when you apply. So when you apply to medical school, you have about like 15 experiences that they let you put down. And that's quite a bit. 15 experiences is a lot. So even if you have one or two research experiences, and then you have one or two volunteering and one or two jobs, that's still only 6 out of 15 things you can write. So I would say, it's not bad to prioritize and say, listen, I want to keep 1 to 2 projects that I that I do for a long periods of time and show that consistency and dedication. But I also want experiences that I do kind of short bursts so I can reflect on a number of experiences. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to put down quite a bit of experiences on your application when you apply to medical school. So having that like tiered approach where you want the long and consistent ones, but you also want a number of experiences, that's how I did it. And that's kind of how I recommend other students do it. I'm going to move on to the next question. Before I do, I also want to give a kind of a disclaimer, just because I see so many people asking questions and so many people like different kinds of questions, and you see it on the chat, like someone posts a question, you'll get a bunch of answers, you know, especially in a Jewish chat, there's 5 people and 10 opinions. So the disclaimer is sometimes you'll hear conflicting things, and it doesn't mean that one is not true. And so I see this in medicine all the time, right? I used to work in an urgent care and I worked in a primary care. And what you would see so classically was patient goes to the urgent care, their kid gets checked for like an ear infection. The PA at the urgent care is like, oh, I don't see anything, doesn't look infected. Kid gets worse because they're not treated. 2 days later, they come to the primary care doctor and they're like, oh, my kid just has this like what seems like a terrible ear infection. I went to the urgent care, they said it was nothing. Doctor looks in the ear and goes, no, this is like a full-blown infection. And so the most like obvious thing that parents 99% of the time will say is, oh man, these urgent cares, they don't know what they're doing. And I always point out that, you know, I'm not here to weigh in on the urgent care PA MD debate here, but it is important to realize that 2 days prior, it probably didn't look like an ear infection. And so if you're not a clinician, what you see is 2 conflicting pieces of information. You're saying you have a PA saying there was no infection. 2 days later, you have an MD saying there is an infection. And the reality is they were both probably correct. 2 days prior probably didn't look like anything. Now it does. And you get this a lot with advice. Just everyone's going to be speaking from their own perspective and from their own experience. And so sometimes what may seem like conflicting information is actually not conflicting. So you may, you know, someone will say, I loved Kaplan. And another person will say, I love Princeton. And, you know, each will claim that whatever they used was better. And the reality is they may be talking about 2 completely different things. One may be talking about in terms of studying for biochemistry, and one may be talking about studying for physics. And what I find is that when lots of questions are asked, they're asked in kind of oversimplified ways. And so if you are going to ask a very simple question, you're going to get a very simple answer. And there's a lot of nuance to these questions. And so you just have to be a little bit careful. So what I always recommend is 2 things. So first off, it's really good to just have a buddy, you know, before running it to a mass amount of people, 200 people on a chat and getting 10 opinions. I'm sure you have friends in undergrad. I'm sure you have friends who are a little bit further in their pre-med career than you are, or may even be in medical school. And it's always good to ask them their opinions and not just like a quick text. You know, it's good to have a full conversation where they can understand the context. And so that's one, is like get a good group of friends. And if you don't have that, or you're looking for someone who is a little bit more senior, get a good like advisor. You know, get someone who you can really sit down and talk to, who is going to hear you out and give you the time of day to explain things. Because I find that that's most of these things really just need context and explanation. So those are my kind of 2 disclaimers. If you hear something tonight that you think is a contradiction to something, it's a good chance it's not, and it probably needs context. And if you have more questions, it's really important to, first off, we hope to do this on a monthly basis, but if you have more questions, you know, try to buddy up with someone to ask questions. I can't tell you how many times I've changed my studying strategy for the boards in medical school based on conversations I had with other students or more senior students. And not everyone more senior is qualified to give advice, right? So just because someone is further in their pre-med career than you doesn't mean they necessarily know what's best, especially if they haven't taken the MCAT or they haven't gotten into medical school and you don't know where they're going to end up. So those are just some kind of generalized pieces of advice I like to give. Okay, so just going on with the questions, I have a question here. Why do hospitals or programs still require COVID vaccines in order to work or do clinicals? So this is not a question for a pre-med session. This is either a very political question or this is like a journal club question, right? So we're debating whether or not the COVID vaccine, I'm not a politician, and so I don't answer COVID questions. And the evidence in terms of if you want to look at like the data and the evidence is that, you know, if you have like 3 installments of the vaccine, then there is some benefit. that's all we can really say. I don't think we know too much more. It's not like an overwhelming amount of evidence that you're saved and totally protected if you have vaccines. And I don't think it's a conversation for this forum as to like why the schools require it. You know, if you want to debate flu vaccine and whether or not we should have religious exemptions, again, not really a debate here. More so just if this is a requirement, this is a requirement. If they require you to wear a certain dress code, you got to either do it or not do it, and that's really it. And debating the why behind it is probably not going to get us very far. So I don't know who asked it. I don't know if who that person's here tonight, but probably not really a question for this forum. All right, which psychology class is the most helpful for the MCAT? Helpful meaning has the most information that will be on the MCAT. So again, at face value, this is a great question, and it is a great question. I'm not going to say it's not a great question, but I think there's context here that I should add as well. And the context here is that there's sort of the assumption that when you take a class, it will prepare you for the MCAT. And that's super dependent on which school you're in. And I would say that most classes you take are really not going to prepare you that well for the MCAT. Like even if you take physics 1, physics 2, biochem, it's not like you're going to get to MCAT studying and be like, oh, I know all of this because I took these classes. At the end of the day, the MCAT's a totally different beast. And a lot of the test has nothing to do with the content per se, but more so how they're presenting the content. A lot of it is like applied, critical thinking. Let's be honest, they just say things in bizarre ways, right? They'll just like disguise the question amongst a ton of extra information. And so a lot of the test is addressing how to do these questions, not so much the content. And I think that's a big mistake I see lots of people studying for the MCAT is assuming, well, I'm gonna dedicate X amount of time for content, and then like all the way at the end, when I feel really comfortable with content, I'm gonna start doing questions. And the people who I've spoken to have done really well. One of the things they've all kind of shared was like, no, I immediately ran to questions. I immediately started getting comfortable with MCAT style questions and how to read long passages and building the endurance to take the test. And it's something that many people may be overlooking. Then I can say that it's not just the MCAT. So in 2015, I think it was, is when the MCAT was redone, right around my era, where it changed in format. And the format was changed to reflect the boards. So having recently taken 2 sets of boards, I actually feel a little bit more comfortable talking about the MCAT because you start to see the pattern. You take enough of these tests, you start to see the pattern. And I will say that studying for boards, a huge part of it is not content. A huge part of it is, can you dissect the questions? Can you approach the questions in the way they're trying to get you to think? And so, that's the context here. The question kind of assumes that the courses will prepare you for the MCAT, and unfortunately, they really don't. Like MCAT is kind of specific. Now, that's not to say it's totally different from the course. Obviously, you need the background to be able to study for the MCAT. So that being said, I would tweak this question. Like, what's the best psychology course I can take that's somewhat helpful for my MCAT? Knowing that, yes, I will just have to totally, change how I study for the MCAT, and there's no way to cover all the material that will be presented on the MCAT, and certainly how to think is not going to be presented in the course. And to answer that, from when I took the MCAT, I think it's still like this, that the psych sociology is really a like definition kind of based section. I don't think it's too much. I don't think you need such a strong like physics, right? You have to know how to approach the question and do the methods and apply the different equations. And psych soc was more so kind of definition, and I don't think they went too in depth. I think it was more so like your intro to psych, intro to sociology will give you a good base for before you studying for your MCAT, and then once you study for the MCAT, you should probably really just doing like MCAT specific psychology, sociology. So my point is that I wouldn't stress too much about the courses you're taking with the MCAT in mind, because when it comes to studying for the MCAT, you're really going to focus on those materials, whatever they use, whether it's Kaplan or Princeton or Blueprint or whatever it is. Those are probably going to be better geared than any course you take. But to answer the question, probably your introductory courses are pretty sufficient to give you a good background on some of the basics, so that when you get to that extra MCAT material, you know what's going on. You're not totally out of left field. Next question is, and if at any point in time someone wants to, challenge me or say, no, Mark, you don't know what you're talking about, that's totally fine. I'm happy to hear the feedback. Or if you have a question that's sort of related and you want me to address it while we're talking on the topic, by all means, please chime in. And we'll try to do like a Q&A really afterwards if I really didn't address whatever question you may have had in mind. All right, number 5. Well, I guess also, probably should have done this in the beginning, but I guess I'll give you a little bit of background of who I am, because I'm imagining some of you don't even know who I am or why we're doing this. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. So I'm a 4th-year downstate student. I did my MD MPH program at downstate. So I finished my first 3 years, took my first 2 sets of boards. I have 1 year of medical school left. I'm not currently enrolled in medical school. I'm currently doing research at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in uro-oncology with hopes of applying to urology when I go back to medical school in June. Like I said, I did my MPH at downstate as part of a dual program. And during this year, I'm doing my MBA while doing research at Sloan. I went to Touro for undergrad, majored in biology, minored in psychology, pretty standard stuff. And as far as like extracurriculars, like, I started the JPN Jewish Physicians Network. I started in my first year of medical school, and it's really geared towards medical students, residents, and physicians. But obviously, as we grew, we wanted to really give back to like the pre-med community. I know you guys struggle with a lot of things. So we created our pre-med chapter, our pre-med group, and we figured this would be a good opportunity to kind of answer some of the questions that come up quite often, and get a little FaceTime with you guys. It's hard on a chat when you're posting, like I said, you're posting those like simplified questions, and you get these overgross simplified answers that don't really help you, or you put up a poll and you get like just every possible answer on the poll. So it's good to have these sessions where we can kind of like clear the air, give that context that's needed, and answer the questions that you guys really have. And I'm a firm believer in full transparency. So full transparency, I got a 511, I think it was. That's how irrelevant it becomes when you get to medical school. But I think I got about a 511 on my MCAT. It actually wasn't my best score, which was very concerning. Like I got a 514 when I did my practices. Then I got a 511. I did fine on my interviews. I had no problem. I got into a bunch of schools. If you know what you're doing, and I'll talk about that at the end, because I don't think anyone asked about it, but I'll talk about it. There's a way of going about the application process, but I would say I was kind of in a lot of people's shoes where maybe my scores weren't the best, but you can certainly still get interviews and applications in and get acceptances. And so, yeah. All right. So now that's a little bit about me. And the reason I say that is because you should know, like sometimes you'll be talking to someone who scored a 525 in their MCAT and they're brilliant, but if you're not brilliant, their advice may not be relevant to you. And so part of the reason why I like doing these sessions is because I would think I'm very much more, close to the typical student who maybe the MCAT is not their strong suit, where they're just gonna crush it. And that's exactly where I was. Okay. How to approach beginning MCAT studying, and what are the best methods, content review, or straight to UWorld and Anki, etc. So these type of questions I find, and I get these a lot, especially in medical school, where like people hear they're supposed to do certain things and then we'll ask a question about it and they don't even know what they're asking. So in medical school we use Anki. Anki is a flashcard program, and so people ask like the first day of medical school, what's the best deck to use in Anki? And I very straightforward will ask, have you ever used Anki? Do you even know what you're asking? And 90% of the time the answer is no, but yet they feel the need to ask this question. So let's break this down. Let's really, forget about the question per se. Let's break down studying for your MCAT, because this is really a whole topic. And last year I actually did a session on MCAT and applications. The video is up on our channel. You can take a look at it. It has a lot of recommendations. I had a few people on there who just did extraordinarily well, talk about their experience. I'm not going to cover things as in depth in this talk, but worth really going over because it's something that comes up a lot. So the best way to think about your MCAT cycle and studying is to really reverse engineer what your goal is. So your goal is to apply to medical school. So we have to work with the application timeline. So the application timeline is that things open up usually like around May 30th or June 1st. It's like the first day you can submit everything. And then it takes a few weeks to get like verified. And then about a month later, they set like July 1st or end of June, they send out the whole batch of whoever was verified within that first month, right? So you can submit it June 1st, takes, let's say, 2, 3, 4 weeks to get verified. And then by, let's say, July 1st, they're saying, okay, anyone who's verified at this point, first wave, we're going to send everyone's application at once. Whoever was on time, we're going to send that to schools. And so it's ideal to get your application out within that first wave. It's probably fine if you did it 2 weeks later. That's not that big a deal. But the point is, you want to be a very early candidate, especially if your scores are not, let's say, not the greatest. So like my score was not the greatest. 511 is good, but really nothing to write home about. So I made it by my business that I was going to be, super early. And the reason why this is super important is because medical schools do rolling admissions, right? So medical schools will take students based on how they come and how they do their interviews before they've interviewed everyone. So even if they're going to interview an excellent candidate later down the line, they may take a weaker candidate who already interviewed and was good enough. And so that's really important. That means you increase your odds of getting in by applying early because of this rolling admissions process. So being on time is super helpful. It definitely helped me in my application cycle, and it's definitely something you'll hear from any reasonable person who knows about the application cycle and knows about medical schools will tell you got to apply on time, and the earlier the better. So that being the goal would be, okay, I want to submit June 1st, and I want to be in that first wave. So if that's the goal, that means you have to have everything in, which means your personal statement, you have to have your 15 experiences written up, you have to have your letters of recommendation all in order. So that takes time. That could take, 2 months sometimes, depending on how on top of it you are and how on top of the people you're working with, how on top of things they are. So in my school, we had like the person who put down your committee, put together your committee letter, which I'll talk about in a second if people are confused, but the person who helped all the students get their application out, she had to review everything. She had to review all your letters of recommendation. She made sure she read your personal statement like 3 times. And it wasn't like you would email to her and she would get it back to you the next day. So every revision of your personal statement took a few days. So it's a lengthy process that people tend to overlook how long it is because there's so many components of your application. So it does take time. Could take a month or two really to get your application in order. So if you wanted to submit June, and it takes about 2 months to get your application, which may be a little bit of a stretch, but it's not so far off. You're talking about like April, May, that means you would want your score in April, May, right? You want to have your score ready to go with your application, or the latest you want your score is really June, right? So ideally you should be taking your MCAT where you have the 2 months to put together your application, and B, your score to go along with your application. So if you wanted April and May to work on your application so that you have it all together by June 1st, and so that by the time June 1st comes around, you'll have your score to go with your application, then you really should be taking it around a little bit, maybe the first or second week in April. That would really make sure that once you finish it, you then have April, May, or May and a little bit of April to put together your application, and that by the time your application is all together by June 1st, you have your score ready to go with your application. That would be ideal. We don't live in a perfect world. Semesters sometimes end January. If you're ending in January, it's kind of hard to make sure that you have your date in April. Like these things happen. It's not the end of the world to apply a little late. And more than that is that people don't always do well their first round of the MCAT. People, end up retaking their MCAT. People push it off. So don't be like heartbroken if you set your timers that like I'm going to take it in April and have my score in June, and then you realize you're not ready and you have to push it off, and then it's pushed off 2 months, and then by the time you get your grade, it's too late to apply, and then you have to kind of wait the year. That happens. It's really normal. I think a lot of people are pressured that like they're 19 and they're too old. Like I have to be in medical school yesterday. Like no, I'll tell you. Like I matriculated to medical school. I think I was 24 at the time. I was married. I had a kid in my second year of medical school right before my boards. Like life goes on. Don't like my little spiel. My little piece of advice is like don't stop life because of pre-med or medical school. if you did that and you were the perfect applicant, which means like you started college at 18 and you went to medical school at 22 because you did 4 years and straight and no gap years and there's no breaks whatsoever. You went straight into medical school from graduation and you're 22 when you start. And then, you didn't take any breaks in medical school, which by the way, it's actually not that uncommon to take a research year in medical school for various reasons. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes you want to apply to something competitive. Lots of people take a gap year. It's not so crazy. But imagine you didn't, right? So you spend another 4 years, you're 26, and then you do the shortest residency, so you can call yourself a doctor in the shortest amount of time, and then you're 29. To give up your entire 20s and not live any of it for this dream of becoming a doctor, I can't tell you how to live your life, but it doesn't seem wise. Like, don't give up life because you're a pre-med student, because you're a medical student, because you're a resident. So my point is, if it don't let it come at the cost of your life. If it's going to cost you that 1 year so that you get the timeline correct, it's not the end of the world, and that happens to most people. So just keep that in mind. But if you were going to play this kind of like game of I want it to be as perfect as possible, then yes, MCAT by April approximately, so you can put together your application and have your score by June. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of studying? So the golden time frame to study is around 3 months. So if you're taking it in April, you're thinking already about January, you're studying. I would say 3 to 4 months. There's no such thing as, perfect. This works for everyone. But this is a generally kind of accepted time frame studying for a test, because longer than that, you typically tend to forget things. And also, it's just not as serious. If you know you have 6 months to exams, human nature is just kind of like, oh, I got plenty of time. It just doesn't like get you to sit down and force yourself to study the same way, knowing you have the biggest exam of your life. And if you in 3 months, that's kind of the generally accepted time frame. And so now going back to the actual question, all that context together, now going back to the actual question was how to approach MCAT studying. What are the best methods, content review or straight to UWorld and Anki? Let's talk about that. So if you have this 3 month, 4 month time frame that you're going to be studying for the exam, it's typically really good. I think it's okay to start a little bit of content review. I think content review early on is fine, just to get your feet wet. People are really nervous about taking diagnostics and doing really poorly, and then it shoots your confidence. And I totally understand that. That's very true. Spending 2 weeks on content just to feel like you've got a little bit like of your feet wet and you got the taste of it and you're getting in a rhythm, I think that's totally fine. But I wouldn't spend very long periods of time just doing content and not doing questions. So I'm a bit firm believer that I get it. You want to bridge into the questions so you don't just shoot your confidence getting every single question wrong. But that's kind of the process, and you will learn through the questions. So it's more so conditioning yourself to learn that when you do questions, it's okay to get questions wrong. It's okay to do very poorly in the beginning. That's part of the learning curve. That's part of the process. And so it's better to condition yourself that way than to think, oh, I just need to just do a ton of content review. So any structure in which you're, maybe 2 weeks, probably not too much longer, of like just pure content review, and then going into like content review / doing questions, and then full length exams. And then as you get close to your exam, you should really be transitioning to more and more time just doing questions. So UWorld was actually not around. Like when I was studying for my MCAT, no one used UWorld. We use it in medical school a lot. I happen to hate UWorld for medical school. I'm going to imagine it's not that different as a pre-med, the kind of questions that UWorld provides. But people really, everyone I talk to seems to use it. So it definitely has become a gold standard in preparing for the MCAT. So I think it's wise to go to UWorld, being that everyone's using it, and this has become a gold standard. And as much as I hated it in medical school, it is a gold standard. I did use it. As far as Anki, so Anki is not really a way to learn. Anki is more so a way to review. I would say it's fine to learn things in Anki if you're just trying to use it for definitions. So let's be honest, a lot of the exam is going to expect you to just know certain things, like what is a Western blot? What is a Northern blot? Nucleic acids, you kind of have to know them a little bit just off the top of your head. So if you're just reviewing those type of things, then Anki is perfect for that. I think there's a very famous deck specifically for the MCAT called like the Jack Sparrow deck. And that seems to be also like a gold standard of people studying for the MCAT. Lots of people have said it's really good quality stuff studying for the MCAT. So, I'm going to put that out there. Anki is a little bit confusing. It's not so user friendly. So I actually made a video for medical students how to use Anki. So you can check out that video if you ever want to get into it and learn the basics of how to use it. Um, it's really not that bad. It's a 5-minute video, so you should be pretty well off by just watching that few-minute video, getting a sense of the lay of the land, and you'll be able to use it. I would recommend this Jack Sparrow deck that everyone kind of swears by, especially the people who did really well have all talked about it. I don't know what kind of topics it has within the deck. So it could be people are saying it's great, but they're specifically talking about biochem or physics. So that would probably be something you need to like explore just a little bit more. But yeah, Anki is generally it's a flashcard app sort of. So it's really just for reviews. It's not really a way to get content down. So typically you'd want to do some sort of content and you want to do questions. And UWorld might be perfect for that. Kaplan, Princeton, Blueprint, these are all kind of, I get this question a lot, which one's the best? I'd be very hard pressed to say that any of them are the best. I think the major flaw with most of them is they just try to tell you have to know everything under the sun. I don't think that's generally true. I think the MCAT does definitely focus on more high yield concepts. And that's usually when I tell people like, check out Scott Roberts. I'm not going to talk too much about him here. But Think MCAT, Scott Roberts, he gives courses. What's nice about his courses is that he really tries to focus on what the MCAT is actually focusing on. He's not just like a Kaplan book where he's going to tell you got to know everything under the sun. He's very specific. He gives you very specific examples to learn from, and it really good stuff. So I usually say like, do Scott Roberts, Think MCAT, do that for content. And then when you're not doing his videos, because I think he does his videos at nights or during the days or one or the other. So when you're not doing his videos or you're not doing his classes or tutoring, then do questions during the day. And I think that's a pretty healthy balance. And then Anki is a great way to review all that. Not to say anything's wrong with Blueprint or the other ones. Scott Roberts is different in the sense he's going to give you more so what the test is doing. And that being said, it may even be a good balance to do a little bit of content review and then do Scott Roberts. And while you're doing Scott Roberts in that second stage of your studying, also start doing more questions. So that's how I would structure my studying for the MCAT if I had to do this over. Thank God I don't. Can you study the MCAT and take it without taking Physics 1 and or Physics 2 in undergrad if you want to take the MCAT before graduation? All I can really say is, again, I feel like the schools don't really prepare you for the MCAT, which means many times you're really just relearning all the material from scratch before you take the MCAT. So it's certainly possible. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a great idea because if you do have background, they'll make your life a lot easier, especially if you're sticking to this 3-month to 4-month like time frame. It's a tight time frame and there's a lot of content to review. So to teach yourself from scratch is probably not a great idea. However, I will say I've seen lots of people do it because lots of people are very ill prepared for these topics anyway when it comes to the MCAT because they didn't really learn it that well in undergrad anyway. So, do you need to take the courses? Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to say. Again, it probably depends on which institution you are and whether or not you're actually learning the content in those classes. I will tell you, I did not learn Physics 1 or Physics 2 well at all. And when it came to the MCAT, I had to reteach it to myself anyway. I'm fairly certain it was the equivalent of not have taken the course. So, do with that what you will. If you're a good student in a good school, it probably will prepare you well. If you're not such a great student and not such a great school, you'll probably have to teach yourself these things anyway. And so I've seen lots of people take the MCAT before taking certain courses. I would say biochem is probably pretty straightforward. You probably should take it before the MCAT because the MCAT has just leaned more and more into biochem over the years. And biochem was pretty straightforward. Then no matter who taught it, it was almost always the same content. I found that less with Physics 1 and Physics 2. All right. Do you have some questions in the chat? Let's see. Oh, you were just taking notes. Hi. Awesome. Okay. Question 8. How often should premeds volunteer to show consistency and commitment, but also in a way that doesn't take away time from studying? For example, is volunteering after the spring semester ends until before the summer semester starts and then continuing after the summer semester until before the fall semester acceptable to med schools? So it's a kind of a lengthy question, but I don't. I'll put it this way. I think we kind of established that about 6 months or so kind of shows. Look, I was pretty consistent and dedicated. If you break those 6 months up into 3 and 3, I think that's pretty. That's fine. I think that that. I mean, I'll put like. I think these questions. Some of these questions get a little bit like overthought. Like I could tell you, like I speak to a lot of these interviewers pretty often, thankfully. So for those who don't know, JPN, our main group of medical students and residents and on, has like 600 people, and I know probably a half a dozen to a dozen people who do medical school interviews and residency interviews, and they really just don't look at your application as much as you think they do. They really don't care. Like they don't care that like you volunteered for a soup kitchen versus you volunteered in a hospital. I remember at one point something went up on our chat about teaching. And so someone wrote, oh, I spoke to a medical school admissions person who said teaching is amazing. And so I think the assumption was that teaching was somehow better than other types of experiences. And the reality is it's really not. It's great. It looks good on an application. Absolutely. If that's what you did and you're putting it down, fantastic. It's not particularly special. The same way being an EMT is not particularly special. The same way being an MA, the same as being a medical scribe. These are very typical things that all pre-meds do, and you just kind of have to do it to show that you're involved. There's no magic. There really is no magic. There's nothing that stands out. No one cured cancer, and everyone just did their basic due diligence to do well. And I think that that's really all they kind of look for. They, I can't. I also will say I can't speak for the Ivy League schools. I've never been an Ivy League student. I didn't apply for the schools, so I really don't know how they operate. Maybe Harvard does go through your application with a fine tooth comb, and I highly doubt that because they have thousands of applicants, and it's just too time consuming to go through every applicant in that way. But maybe they do. But I will tell you, vast majority of normal middle tier schools certainly don't really care that all too much. There's just general certain rules to follow. So it's good to show consistency. It's good to show dedication. And so if you're doing that for about 6 months, but you broke it up and you did 3 months, did a semester, and you went back, that's should be fine. You can always say, oh, I had this experience and I took time off to focus on my studies and I went back to it. I don't think that would ever get anyone kind of penalized. I will say sometimes medical schools on purpose will try to trip you up, not as like a mean way, but kind of just to like see how you operate a little bit under pressure. So they'll throw you like a devil's advocate type of question, right? So I know at downstate where I am, they always pick the weakest part of your application and ask you about it. And it's not like, gotcha. It's more of a just like, how do you respond? And so I can see what I'm saying now being taken totally out of context, where someone going, Marc said it's fine if I did 3 months and then stopped and then 3 months. And then on my interview, they asked me why I took a break and they made it like it's a bad thing. And they might do that. They might go, why did you take a break? And it's totally fine to say, things were difficult. I really want to focus on my studies, but I was really dedicated to go back. And that's a fine answer. But if you get tripped up and you say, I didn't really take a break, I tried to do it, that's not going to come off well. And so I had that with a student who didn't do so well in her MCAT. Sorry, she didn't. She didn't do so well on her MCAT. She did fine with her grades, and they asked her why she didn't do so well on her MCAT, and she said, "Well, my grades are great, and that's really reflective of who I am." But I guess the way she said it sounded more like an excuse, and so it just conversation kind of spiraled. Whereas like she could have easily kind of navigated that by saying, my grades are what my grades are because I am a good student. I was going through some things and my MCAT didn't turn out as I wanted. And she probably wouldn't have got blasted. But because of how she answered it, same answer, just with a different connotation, and it came out like she was making excuses, they didn't like that. So it's more so how you present it rather than the actual what you did. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Is it mandatory to do research to get into an MD school? If yes, in which ways can you do research? So for those who don't know, I do a lot of research, and I usually like every 2 months or 3 months or so, I offer like an opportunity for about like 8 to 10 students to come join me in doing some of my research. Research is one of my kind of hidden talents. Um, you do have to do research to get into MD school. Like 97% of students do research. And so you don't want to be the odd student who just doesn't have it. So you should have research. You really should if you're going to go to an MD school. And MD schools are just getting more and more competitive. As far as if what goes, so if anyone's done research with me, which I know a few of you have, you know that my general policy is everything and anything goes because it's really hard to go find research, and research is not something that's fair really to expect a pre-med to know how to do on their own or to know how to do in general. And so usually whatever you get your hands on is fine as long as you're able to talk about it. And that's a general rule for everything. It's not just what you do, and putting it on paper. You have to be able to talk about it in an interview. And it's not that hard to know how to talk about it. When I do my sessions with students and they join my research, I dedicate a specific amount of time to teach you how to talk about it. So you sound intelligent, you sound involved. So it's certainly something that could be done. And it's not hard. It just takes a little bit of training to prepare yourself how to answer these questions. But the short of it is, yes, you need research. Doesn't really matter. If you did it in a hospital, that's fine. If you did it in a lab, that's fine. If you were a technician, that's fine. As long as you're able to talk about it and how you played some meaningful role in the point of the research, rather than just saying, oh, I put things into an Excel, you should be fine. But research probably could go, for its own talk for quite a while. But to answer it, you need research, and really anything goes. What are some things to consider when looking into MD schools other than cost and location? So I want to focus on the location thing for a second because I think people, at least I had one applicant who recently very obviously overlooked the importance of location. And he was scared to tell the school that he wanted to go there because of the location. So he was scared to say that he wanted to go because he lives right next to the school. He's like, oh, to me, it just didn't sound so good to say. And I was like, well, yeah, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound good at all. You don't tell a school I want to go there because I live 2 doors down. But there's a great way to spin that, which is you explain to the school, because I live close by, I know that I'll do well in this environment because my life won't be totally perturbed and I have the support I need to succeed. And that's really important to medical schools. So I think something that people kind of overlook is you assume that students getting into medical school are like superheroes, right? They're like, whoa, they got into medical school. They're regular students. They often their lives are quite messy in medical school because that's just a period of life that you're in your mid-20s. It's exciting, and maybe you're starting a family, or your parents are now a little bit older and they're getting sick, and like these things happen all the time. People fail medical school more often than they would like to admit. Every year I get students who fail, and depending on how much you fail, that will change like what you have to do to make up for it. But the point is that failing is not as uncommon as we like to believe it to be. So it does happen quite often, actually. And to be able to tell a school that I have a lot of family support because I live close by and my whole family's here and I know the area and I'm well settled here, and therefore I'll have a lot of support when I start school and I'm confident I'll do well, that means a lot to a school. That means a lot to them because they don't want to have to deal with failures. They don't want to have to deal with people struggling emotionally and isolation. Medical school is hard enough. Tack on a totally new environment, it's really difficult. So to be able to tell them, I grew up here and I know the community and I like serving the community and I'm part of the community and my family's here and I have all the support. And so I think I would do the best here versus any other school. That's a much better answer than saying I live 2 doors down, so I want to come here. But it's really the same exact thing. It's just a better, you're elaborating better why it makes a difference that you're close by. And so location is really important, and you can express that on an interview, but you should just practice on how you're going to express these things, because I think that's something that gets lost in translation. As far as other things to consider, but other than location and cost, two things I would say. So one is, and this is kind of hard, but is like if you know what kind of specialty you want to go into, like the school you're going to makes a big difference. Certain schools just have really strong departments. And so if you know you want to go to an advanced and you know that your school has a strong department, it helps. So a perfect example is I like surgery. I wasn't sure where I wanted to go. I It was like, okay, maybe ENT, maybe orthopedics, maybe ophthalmology. I said definitely not urology. And then life has a really funny way of saying, nope, and the thing you thought you would never go into in a million years is the thing that you're going to end up pursuing. So I ended up pursuing urology. And part of that decision was because I happened to be at Downstate, and Downstate has probably, not probably, a study came out that they are actually the #2 school in the country of producing urologists. That majorly impacted my decision, knowing that I had such good support from my school and they had such a strong department that I'd be able to go far in my career if I chose that field of medicine. Whereas if I wanted to do neurosurgery, Downstate hasn't had a neurosurgeon. Forget about like a residency. Like they haven't had a neurosurgeon in who knows how long. They haven't had their own. So getting into neurosurgery would have been close to impossible. Whereas New York Medical College has a much stronger neurosurgery relationship with Westchester Medical School Center. Sorry. So if I knew that I was dead set on neurosurgery, which again, I'm not crazy, so I'd be like pretty nuts to know as a pre-med, you're dead set on neurosurgery. You're pretty much saying, I'm top 1% of top 1%, and I'm definitely going to get it. That would be a bit much. But the point I'm making is that schools differ in their abilities and their departments. And so that's one thing that could be taken into account. It's not often taken into account because it's hard to know what you want to do. But those reflect in the match rates. If you like OBGYN, maybe one school has a better OBGYN department. Maybe, schools often have their own residencies. So Downstate has Downstate Hospital and has their own residencies. So if you're thinking between, I've had this before where someone was thinking between Downstate, which is an MD program, and NYIT Com, which is a DO program. Now, first off, in general, if you're thinking between MD and DO, I mean, there's no reason not to do MD. Like your life will just be easier having those two letters after your name versus a DO. And I don't mean that you'll be a better doctor. I just mean when you apply for residencies, MDs outrank DOs. That's just the stats. That's what the stats show. They like 70% in my field, about 70% of MDs match, whereas the percentage of DOs that match is significantly lower. It's just harder for DOs. That's all. It's not a reflection on their skills. So, anyways, they had this question, NYIT or Downstate. Now, one really important consideration would be Downstate has their own hospital and therefore their own residencies, whereas NYIT did not. And so that's a major consideration that you'll have an easier time matching, not just because you have those two letters after your name, but your home institution has a department and will have the ability for you to get to know the department, and for you to get to know them before you apply for residency. You're much more likely to match in their residency. So that's one thing that I think people overlook is you can look at match rates, you can look at various hospitals, and if you ask enough students who are at that school, they may be able to tell you where that school shines and what that department looks like at the school that you might be interested in. So that's one thing. Probably not all too helpful because most students don't know what they want to go into. The other thing that I would look into is the curriculum. So one thing that I kind of lucked out, and I didn't know this before going to Downstate, was very easy curriculum. Like we do it in blocks, and our blocks reflect national examinations. So if you're preparing for a national examination, then you're really preparing for your Downstate examination. And the reason why that's so important is because that means I didn't really have to attend Downstate lectures. I was able to use third-party resources. So to put it in terms that may be a little bit more familiar for you, imagine your physics class was based solely on what the MCAT physics were. So instead of listening to your professor, you can read an MCAT physics book and be perfectly prepared for your exam. That's a really big deal because the MCAT physics book is probably a lot better than your professor. So that's what I found in medical school, that the Downstate's curriculum was really great because I was able to prepare, not really relying on Downstate's resources. I was able to rely on third-party resources, which were generally much better. And then also, we didn't have such frequent testing. So Einstein has like a graded quiz every week. And that's really stressful. And like to do that in medical school is a big pain in the butt. But when you are only tested once every 2 months, yeah, trust me, those exams are intense and they're many hours long. But that means when they were done and we started the next block, I had 2 weeks where I can kind of like breathe and like not really worry and wait to catch up later because I didn't have such continuous testing. Whereas in Einstein, you have a quiz every week. You always have to be on top of your game. And so, based on how the curriculum is structured, really changes how you live your life. I always knew come exam time, things were going to be stressful, and then I get a little bit of a break. If you're at a different school, that may not be the case. And so those are some things that you would want to ask, like medical students at these schools that you're interested in. What does the curriculum look like? Are you happy there? Are you happy there is a huge question. Many people will just say yes, whatever, but you can kind of suss out like what's real. Like when people ask me if I was happy at Downstate, I'd be like, I always put it this way. I was like, I was at Downstate, I did my MPH, I had a kid, and I started a nonprofit organization for 600 people. I clearly had time on my hands at some point, and I think that's very reflective of um, what kind of curriculum that is, right? That I had all the time to do those things. Um, we're running out the clock here, so let's see. What are some things to consider when looking into, okay, cost and location? We did that. How many clinical experiences do I really need to have? What exactly is considered a clinical experience other than being a medical assistant? Right. So I get this question quite often. Okay. How many experiences you have? Again, just remember when you apply, you'll have about 15 things you need to write about. You can probably get away with 10 real ones and 5 fake ones. And when I say 5 fake ones, it's like anytime you were published, that counts as one, a hobby counts as one, other extracurriculars count as one. Like I was the president of the student club, that counts as one. There's like a bunch of silly stuff that you could put in there, but you do want some meat and potatoes. And so you have about probably 10 meat and potatoes ones. And out of the 10 meat and potatoes ones, you divide it, right? Some will be clinical experiences, some will be research. Trying to think what else I had in there. I had extracurriculars, I had hobbies, I had awards. It's kind of a mix. So I would say probably fair if you have about 2 to 3 research ones. 2 to 3 clinical experiences are good, and then you can kind of figure out the rest. It's not you just keep in mind there's about 15. You don't have to necessarily put all 15. You can get away with putting 13, and that'll be fine. And you just map it out, like how many do you need in total. A few is good, a few of each, a few research things, a few clinical experiences. And there's no such thing as clinical experience as defined by X, Y, and Z. There's no such thing as, we have criteria you have to have interacted with at least 5 patients every day that you were there to be considered a clinical experience. There's no such thing. So when we say clinical experience, we really mean some form of you were involved in the medical environment. It's like super vague. And that's good because really anything goes. So being an EMT counts, being a medical assistant counts, being a medical scribe counts. Even shadowing and volunteering can be clinical if you're in a clinical setting. You could be a volunteer scribe. There's no difference if you're getting paid or you're a volunteer, you're doing the same job. It's good when you get paid, A, because you make money, but B, because you're showing that your skills were actually useful. And so value them, which is great because I think being a volunteer really just shows that someone was happy to take your work for free, which doesn't tell you much about what you did. But really all those things count, and there's no such thing, you took care of someone with dementia. That's a form of a clinical experience. It's not as intensive as being an EMT, but it certainly counts. You put it on your resume. You took care of a kid with autism. Those are clinical experiences. There's a patient in front of you, and you're providing some sort of care. So that's really the benchmark to value those experiences. There's really nothing special there. When should I ask for letters of recommendation? Do I collect the letters and submit them with my application, or do those who write letters submit them themselves? Generally speaking, you're supposed to have like a committee, like someone who's putting this all together. Usually there's like some sort of advisor or someone. Most schools have like a point person that the letter writers will send it directly to that person, and you're supposed to waive your right to see the letters. It kind of shows like a vote of confidence that even without viewing the letter, you know that the person who's writing it on your behalf will write something positive. They send it to this person, so whoever your school kind of appoints as that person, and that person is supposed to put them all together as part of your application, and is supposed to write a committee letter, which is it's like a themed letter, which is they're supposed to read all your letters of recommendation and put them together and write a letter that really puts together all the bits and pieces from your various letters. So if every letter writer who wrote a letter of recommendation for you wrote how good you are and how dedicated you are, and how passionate you are, those are some key words that your committee letter might reflect. Like, as you can see from all these letters, this student is brilliant. This student is passionate. You know, they'll try to find that theme underlying all the letters and try to present you as an applicant in total. So that way, when your application gets presented, they can read that committee letter and say, oh, okay, I get who this student is without having to read each and every individual letter. So generally, they get sent to this person who's designated as like the point person. Um, and so when do you ask for them? So I'm generally of the opinion, ask for them a few months in advance before you're getting your application ready, because it takes a while for these people to get their act together, and you're going to have to follow up with them multiple times. So if you want your letters in by April time, because again, that's what we said, you're going to start like thinking about putting together your application, and you want that committee person to have the chance to read all of them and write you their letter, and all these things take time. It's a pretty good idea to start asking them in January, February, March, to say, okay, I really need to get all my letters in so my letter writers can have the time to write them and submit them. So I wouldn't necessarily, it depends. And also, like, if you plan on asking a professor who you're never going to have a class with again, it might be wise to ask them right after your last class with them. So let's say you bond with your Bio 1, Bio 2 professor. You had them for a full year because you had them for 2 semesters, and you want them to write you a letter, but you know that you're not going to need your letter for another 3 years. It's still fine to ask them after that Bio 2 class, say, hey, I'm going to be applying to medical school. Can you write me a letter of recommendation? Ask them while they still know you. So generally, you want to ask before you're putting together your application. But if there's a chance that that person is going to forget who you are by the time you ask for it when they still know you. Ask for it after the courses, when they can still write a nice letter that sounds like they actually know who you are. So those are kind of the two times you would ask, either when it's appropriate, when let's say you're finishing a job or finishing a research thing, or if you know you'll have constant communication with them, then when you're starting to think about putting together your application. It's 9 o'clock. I have like 2 minutes. So we have like 5 questions left. I'm going to just pick one and then I'll go from there. What are secondary applications? I'm not going to address because just Google that. How do medical schools usually look at retaking courses? Usually not so great. If you had to retake a course, it just probably didn't. If you didn't do well the first time, it doesn't look so pretty to retake it. Do I need to be done taking all prerequisite courses for med school by the time I submit my medical school application? If I apply towards the end of undergrad, or can I take some of them after apply? You can definitely take some of them after you apply. You could be taking 1 or 2 required courses while you're in the application cycle. That's fine. But just keep in mind, if it's a really important one like biochem, that's not such a great idea, because they want to see those like, heavy, juicy courses that you took them and did well. If it's like, oh, you have to take pre-calc, yeah, like no one will care. You could do that as long as that you're finished that course by the time you matriculate to medical school. It's fine if you're doing it during the application cycle. So that's the only thing to consider, is like, what kind of course is this? But it's fine to be taking it then. Cornell Medical College seeks students who have broad liberal arts education. If a pre-med student wants to take mostly biology electives, does that not satisfy this? Okay, I usually don't answer questions about specific schools, but yeah, I mean, listen, if they're saying we want you to have social sciences, we want you to have liberal arts, then correct. Biology is not like a liberal arts. Like, you got to have some other courses. I really don't have time to address this last one. How can I find research opportunities? I'll answer it quickly. Join the JPN. We post opportunities all the time. I do lots of research. I have students join me all the time. I'm also happy to answer questions if people reach out to me privately. So I would just leave off there. It was really great talking to you guys. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you're not currently on our JPN chat, make sure to join the chat. If you have questions beyond this talk that I didn't address, that you're really just itching to hear, feel free to text me. I'm really accessible, and I'm happy to answer questions on a one-on-one basis. And yeah, I really hope you guys found this helpful. Good luck. I know you guys can do it. It's not as bad. It gets better. I promise. You just need good advisement. Please seek advisement. Like, even if you think you know everything, seek advisement. Because most of the students I talk to that are in a pickle, that are in the application cycle and it's January and they haven't gotten a single interview, it's because they thought they knew everything. So even if you think you know everything, like, ask questions or just chat with someone who knows more. I promise you'll learn from those conversations. I gotta head out. That's the joy of being a dad and having little kids at home. So It was great talking to you guys. Good luck, and feel free to reach out to myself or Chaya if you have any questions. All right. Take care. Have a good night.